The wind howled through the dusty streets of Red Hollow, as if the land itself was whispering warnings. It rattled the loose shutters of the saloon and dragged coils of dry grass across the empty road. People hurried past one another with lowered voices and anxious glances toward the hill at the edge of town. On that hill stood a wooden frame that had not been there the day before. A gallows. The fresh timber creaked softly in the wind, the rope swaying like a patient serpent waiting for its moment. And beneath it stood a woman. Her name was Eliza Rowan. To most of Red Hollow, however, she was no longer Eliza. To them she was something far worse. "She's a witch," someone whispered near the general store. "I seen her talking to herself in the woods. My cattle died the same week she arrived. She cursed the rain." Rumors spread through Red Hollow like wildfire through dry prairie grass. Eliza stood with her hands bound in front of her, her long dark hair whipping across her pale face. Dust clung to the hem of her faded blue dress, and her boots were cracked from weeks of walking. She had come to Red Hollow hoping for a quiet place to disappear. Instead, she had found a town ready to hang her. The sheriff, a heavy-set man named Dalton Graves, paced before the gathered crowd. His mustache twitched every time someone shouted another accusation. "Order," he barked. "We'll handle this proper." But there was nothing proper about what was happening. The townsfolk had already made up their minds. Women clutched their children close as if Eliza might suddenly burst into flames or summon lightning from the sky. Men glared at her with the same hatred they reserved for rustlers and killers. Eliza said nothing. Not because she was proud. Because she was tired. For years she had run from places like this. Ever since the night her mother died. Her mother had been a healer, one of the few women who knew the language of plants and roots. People had once come from miles away seeking her help for fevers, broken bones, and poisoned wounds. Until one winter when a child died despite her medicine. That was when the whispers began. Witch. Cursebringer. Devil woman. By spring, their cabin had been burned to the ground. Her mother had not survived the flames. And Eliza had learned the most dangerous truth in the world. People fear what they do not understand. The sheriff stopped pacing and turned toward her. "You got one last chance, girl," he said loudly so the crowd could hear. "Confess what you are." Eliza slowly raised her head. Her green eyes moved across the faces surrounding her. Fear. Anger. Self-righteous fury. The same expressions she had seen a dozen times before in other towns. "I'm not what you think," she said quietly. Someone in the crowd spat. "Liar. You cursed the Miller boy. You brought the drought. She killed my dog." Eliza closed her eyes. She hadn't killed anyone. She had only tried to help. 2 nights earlier she had treated young Thomas Miller's fever using willow bark and herbs from the riverbank. The boy had worsened before he improved. In their fear, the town had decided she was poisoning him. When the boy began convulsing from the fever, panic had turned to rage. And rage needed someone to blame. So they built the gallows. Sheriff Graves cleared his throat. "Well," he said coldly. "Seems the town's spoken." He turned toward the gallows. "Time to finish this." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people looked excited. Others looked uneasy. But none stepped forward to stop it. 2 men dragged Eliza toward the wooden platform. The rope swayed above her head. For the first time that day, fear pierced through her exhaustion. Not fear of dying. Fear that her mother had died believing the world might someday grow kinder. Eliza stepped onto the platform. The boards creaked beneath her weight. A man named Walter Briggs tightened the rope around the beam overhead. He avoided looking at her face. Even cowards have limits. Sheriff Graves turned to the crowd again. "If anyone objects to this justice." He paused. No one spoke. The silence felt like a stone pressing against Eliza's chest. Then a voice broke through the wind. "Hold." It was a quiet word. Barely louder than the rustling dust. Yet somehow every person in Red Hollow heard it. Heads turned toward the far end of the street. A rider had appeared. No one had seen him enter town. He sat motionless on a tall black horse. The animal's coat gleaming even under the harsh desert sun. The man himself was dressed in dark clothes worn smooth by long travel. A wide brim hat shadowed his face, hiding his eyes. The only visible detail was the silver badge of a Colt revolver resting low on his hip. The stranger dismounted slowly. Boots touched the dirt. And he began walking toward the gallows. Each step was calm. Unhurried. As if he had all the time in the world. Sheriff Graves frowned. "Town business," he called. "Move along, stranger." The men kept walking. Dust swirled around his boots. When he finally looked up, the entire town felt something shift. His eyes were gray. Cold. Sharp enough to cut through lies. He stopped at the edge of the platform. His gaze moved to Eliza. For the first time since morning, someone looked at her without hatred. Without fear. Only quiet assessment. Eliza felt her breath catch. The stranger turned back to the sheriff. What's the charge? Graves scoffed. She's a witch. The man's expression didn't change. Evidence. The sheriff gestured vaguely toward the crowd. Plenty. A few men shouted accusations. She poisoned a Miller boy. She cursed the cattle. She talks to spirits. The stranger listened without interruption. When the shouting died down, he spoke again. That's not evidence. Graves' face reddened. This ain't your concern. The stranger finally placed his hand lightly on the wooden railing of the gallows. The simple movement carried an odd authority. It is now. The sheriff's hand drifted toward his revolver. You got a name? The stranger paused. Then he said quietly, Ethan Cross. The name meant nothing to most of the town. But one man near the saloon gasped. A former bounty hunter. He whispered to his neighbor. Cross, that's the men who tracked the Black Canyon gang. Another voice murmured. 10 men alone. Fastest gun in 3 territories. Unease spread through the crowd. Sheriff Graves noticed the whispers. His jaw tightened. You threatening this town, mister? Ethan Cross looked at him with the same calm expression. No. He nodded toward Eliza. I'm claiming her. The entire street fell silent. Graves blinked. Claiming. Ethan stepped onto the gallows platform. The rope swayed above them. He stood beside Eliza like a stone wall. She's mine, he said. Gasps erupted across the crowd. What does that even mean? Someone shouted. Ethan's voice remained steady. It means if she hangs, I hang the men responsible. The words were not loud. But they carried a promise heavy as iron. Sheriff Graves laughed harshly. You think one man scares a whole town? Ethan slowly unbuttoned his coat. The butt of his revolver gleamed in the sunlight. Then he spoke 4 simple words. I know it does. The wind blew harder. Dust spiraled through the street. And for the first time that day, the people of Red Hollow began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Behind him, Eliza stared at the stranger who had just placed himself between her and death. She had never seen him before. Yet somehow his presence felt like the first ray of light after a long winter. Ethan glanced sideways at her. His voice dropped to a low murmur meant only for her. Don't be afraid. Eliza swallowed. Why are you helping me? For a moment, the silent gunslinger said nothing. Then he looked back at the crowd gathering below the gallows. Because, he said quietly, I've seen what happens when a town kills the wrong woman. And the way he said it made Eliza realize something chilling. This wasn't the first time Ethan Cross had arrived too late. The wind swept across the gallows again, tugging at the rope that hung above Eliza Rowan's head. The rough fibers creaked against the wooden beam. A soft sound that seemed far louder in the heavy silence that had fallen over Red Hollow. No one moved. No one spoke. Every pair of eyes in the town was fixed on the stranger standing beside the condemned woman. Ethan Cross. The name moved through the crowd like a slow ripple across still water. Some men shifted uneasily. A few stepped back from the platform without realizing they had done it. Even Sheriff Dalton Graves felt a tightening in his chest, though he tried to hide it behind a scowl. Ethan stood with calm stillness, his gray eyes sweeping across the crowd. He didn't look angry. He didn't look afraid. He simply looked certain. And certainty can be far more frightening than rage. You're interfering with justice, Sheriff Graves said finally, though his voice carried less confidence than before. Ethan tilted his head slightly. This, he asked. You call this justice? Graves gestured angrily toward the people gathered around the gallows. The town voted. Several men shouted in agreement. Hang the witch. She cursed the Miller boy. Finish it. Ethan didn't raise his voice. Instead, he stepped closer to the edge of the platform and looked directly at the crowd. Which one of you saw her cast a curse? He asked. No one answered. He pointed toward a man near the saloon. You. The man swallowed and shook his head. Ethan looked at another. Or you. The man looked away. Ethan's gaze moved slowly across the crowd. So none of you saw it, he said. Murmurs began to rise again. Sheriff Graves clenched his jaw. We don't need to see it. He snapped. Strange things started happening when she came here. Ethan nodded slowly. What things? Graves pointed toward the Millers standing near the front. The boy got sick. The Miller woman clutched her husband's arm. Our son nearly died. Ethan looked at them. Is he dead? No, the woman admitted quietly. He's recovering. Ethan turned back to the sheriff. So the boy is alive. Graves hesitated. That ain't the point. It's exactly the point. The calm certainty in Ethan's voice made the crowd restless again. He gestured toward Eliza. She treated the boy, didn't she? No one answered. But the truth hung in the air. Finally, old Mr. Carter from the livery stable spoke up. She did bring herbs, he admitted. The murmurs grew louder. Sheriff Graves' face reddened. That don't prove nothing. Ethan's eyes hardened slightly. No, he agreed. But it proves you're hanging the wrong person. Eliza stood silently beside him, barely able to breathe. She had faced angry towns before. But never had anyone stood in front of that anger like this. Never had anyone chosen to fight it. Sheriff Graves suddenly reached for the rope hanging above them. That's enough, he growled. We're done talking, Dot. He turned to the two men standing beside the lever that would drop the trapdoor. Do it. The men hesitated. Ethan's hand drifted slowly toward the revolver at his hip. Not threatening. Just ready. The movement was small. But everyone saw it. The men at the lever stepped back. Sheriff Graves slammed his fist against the railing. You cowards. Ethan's voice came again, calm and steady. You hang her, he said. And the first man who touches that rope is the first man I bury. A hush swept through the crowd. Even the wind seemed to pause. Graves stared at him. You think you can fight this whole town? Ethan met his gaze without blinking. No, he said quietly. I don't need to. The sheriff frowned. Before he could respond, a shout came from the far end of the street. Sheriff. Everyone turned. It was Samuel Miller, the older brother of the sick child. He skidded to a stop at the edge of the crowd. Sheriff. You gotta come quick. What is it? Graves snapped. Samuel pointed back toward the Miller house. Tommy woke up. The crowd murmured. He's asking for the lady. The entire street fell silent again. Sheriff Graves stared at him. What? Samuel nodded urgently. He keeps saying she saved him. A wave of confusion spread through the townspeople. The Miller mother gasped. My boy's awake. Yes, ma'am. The sheriff looked from Samuel to Eliza and back again. Ethan spoke softly beside her. Well, he said, that's inconvenient. Some of the men in the crowd shifted awkwardly. The certainty they had felt only minutes earlier began to crumble. Sheriff Graves tried to hold onto his authority. Doesn't matter, he insisted. She's still. Still what? The new voice came from behind the crowd. A woman pushed her way forward. Mrs. Whitaker, the town's midwife. Her gray hair was tied back tightly, and her sharp eyes glared at the sheriff. I saw the herbs she used, she said firmly. They were fever medicine. The murmurs grew louder. She didn't poison the boy, Mrs. Whitaker continued. She saved him. Someone in the crowd whispered nervously. Then why did he get worse first? Eliza finally spoke. Because fever breaks before it leaves, she said quietly. All eyes turned toward her. Her voice trembled slightly, but she forced herself to continue. The body fights the sickness. Sometimes it gets worse before it heals. Mrs. Whitaker nodded slowly. That's true. The crowd shifted again. Sheriff Graves could feel control slipping through his fingers. He pointed angrily at Eliza. She's still strange. People seen her in the woods talking to herself. Eliza lowered her eyes. I wasn't talking to myself, she said softly. Ethan glanced at her. Then who? She hesitated. The entire town leaned forward. My mother, she said. A gasp rippled through the crowd. See. Graves shouted triumphantly. Which? But Eliza shook her head. My mother taught me medicine, she said. Her voice was quiet but steady now. When she died. I kept speaking to her because it helped me remember what she taught. Silence followed. The explanation was simple. Painfully human. The terrifying mystery the town had imagined suddenly seemed far less convincing. Sheriff Graves clenched his fists. He could feel the mood shifting. If the town doubted him now, he would lose everything. So he did what desperate men often do. He reached for his gun. The movement was fast. But Ethan Cross was faster. The sound of his revolver. Leaving the holster cracked. Through the air like thunder. Before anyone could blink. The barrel of his Colt was aimed directly at the sheriff's chest. Graves froze. The entire town held its breath. Ethan's voice remained calm. Don't. The sheriff's hand hovered inches from his own weapon. You'd shoot the law. He growled. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. I'd shoot a murderer. A bead of sweat slid down Graves' temple. Around them, people began backing. Away from the gallows. No one wanted to stand between two armed men. The wind picked up again, rattling the wooden platform beneath their boots. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then a small voice broke the tension. Please don't hurt her. Everyone turned. A wagon had arrived at the edge of the street. Inside it lay young Tommy Miller, pale but awake, wrapped in blankets. His mother knelt beside him. The boy pointed weakly toward the gallows. That lady helped me, he whispered. The final piece of anger shattered in the crowd. Sheriff Graves saw it happen. The hatred that had fueled the mob was gone. Now there was only shame. He slowly lowered his hand. Ethan lowered his revolver a moment later. The sheriff stepped back from the rope. For the first time that day, the gallows looked like what it truly was. A terrible mistake. Mrs. Whitaker climbed onto the platform and untied Eliza's hands. The rope above them swayed uselessly in the wind. The crowd began to disperse quietly. Some people avoided looking at Eliza. Others muttered apologies. But most simply walked away, unwilling to face what they had almost done. Ethan holstered his revolver and stepped down from the gallows. Eliza followed slowly. Her legs trembled when her boots touched the ground again. Freedom felt unreal. She looked at Ethan. "Why did you come here?" He adjusted his hat slightly. "I was passing through." "That's not what I meant." He studied her face for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. "Years ago, a town did this to someone I cared about." Eliza's heart tightened. "And you couldn't stop it?" "No." The single word carried years of regret. "So this time," he continued, "I made sure I arrived early." Eliza looked back at the empty gallows on the hill. The rope still swung in the wind. "But why say I was yours?" she asked softly. Ethan's expression softened slightly. "Because sometimes the only way to stop a mob," he glanced at the dusty street, now almost empty, "is to make them think someone more dangerous is standing in their way." Eliza felt a faint smile touch her lips. "Well," she said, "I suppose I owe you my life." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Maybe." He turned toward his horse. The sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky gold and crimson. Eliza hesitated. "Where will you go now?" Ethan placed a boot in the stirrup. "Wherever the road leads." He paused. Then he looked back at her. "You could come." Eliza blinked. "Why?" Ethan considered the question. Then he gave the simplest answer. "Because," he said. "Every good healer deserves a place where people don't build gallows first." For a moment she said nothing. Then Eliza Rowan stepped forward. And together they rode out of Red Hollow. Behind them, the gallows stood alone on the hill. A silent reminder of how close a town had come to hanging an innocent woman. And how one quiet stranger had changed everything. If you enjoyed this powerful Wild West story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more dramatic cowboy and mail-order bride stories filled with mystery, courage, and unforgettable twists. Your support helps bring many more incredible frontier tales to life.